While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust, and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Big data. It's one of those terms that was way overused and therefore simultaneously became an easily recognizable term for the ever-expanding amount of information flowing through a network, as well as something that, while critically important, was talked about so much that it became easy to ignore. The good and the bad is that not everyone suffered from this fatigue, especially the hackers. According to Fortinet's 2024 State of Operational Technology and Cybersecurity report, 43% of those surveyed reported a loss of business critical data or intellectual property so far in 2024. That number is up nearly 10% from last year, and we all know what happens with this hijacked data. Per the World Economic Forum's May 2024 white paper, the number of ransomware attacks on industrial infrastructure doubled in 2023. Boosting ransomware to the leading concern for manufacturers with 40%, citing it as their top issue. While that may not surprise you, this might. Due to the many challenges we've discussed here on Security Breach, the industrial sector now accounts for 71% of all ransomware attacks. Our data is valuable, and the hackers know it. But here to offer some perspective on protecting this data is Karthik Krishnan, CEO of Concentric.ai. They're a leading provider of data security posture management solutions that utilize deep learning to discover and classify sensitive data, identify risk, and remediate issues. Karthik, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Excellent. So we're just going to dive right into it here. In the manufacturing sector, as you know, we've got data flowing all over the place. We've got operational data, we've got financial data, intellectual property, personal information. All of this stuff is available in a lot of different places, and it creates a lot of challenges. So kicking it over to you, what are you seeing in terms of what are hackers going for in terms of the type of data that they're targeting in industrial organizations, and how are they getting to it most prominently?
Data remains the lifeblood of the most industries, particularly the industrial sector. And as someone said, data is the new oil, and so it can go in any different direction you want. I think primarily enterprises are struggling, especially in the industrial sector, with a lot of sort of critical sensitive data. That could be financial data, could be intellectual property data. Some of them even have very sensitive export control data, and of course the most obvious ones, which is customer data. And the reality of the modern world is between spear phishing and even things like generative AI technology starting to drive more sophisticated spear phishing into enterprise. The reality is most enterprises are just one click away from getting compromised. Whether it's ransomware or whether it's malware intended to target specific users, it has become a lot easier to be able to gain a foothold into the enterprise network. And then once you're in, it really is a question of what data you get access to. And data very quickly becomes the most vulnerable threat surface. And the more data that you have available for people to access, the more vulnerable you've made yourself.
Are you seeing any particular soft spots that sort of stand out that are consistently being exploited?
It really starts with your employees.
Yeah.
It's become, for example, now with things like generative AI, it's become really easy for me to find a way to get you to click. I mean, on anything. In fact, I see some extremely, as the CEO of the company, I see like very, very sophisticated attempts to try to get me to pay some vendor bills. And it's easier to mimic my style. You can pretty much listen to, you can go on the web and you can pull up my profile and you can get a good sense of how you can potentially get a response out of me, knowing my connections and stuff like that. Your employees continue to be the easiest conduit into your network. And once you're in, it's extremely easy to raise your privileges and go from there.
Yeah, I think that's I want to dive into this a little bit more because I think when we talk about the operational technology environment, we're concerned about all the proprietary information and all of the different data that we're generating during the production process. And we're very mindful of keeping that secure. But when it comes to personal data, we just seem a lot more lax. We just don't think it's that big of a deal or that important. Somebody can get that off my Facebook page or whatever the case may be. Maybe you could dive into that a little bit and tell us, why is that so important to also protect a lot of that personal data, that employee data, and what that can lead to down the line if you're not paying attention to those security measures?
Yeah, we have today like industrial HVAC manufacturers and chemical manufacturers that basically leverage our solutions. And the focus is on the fact that they have a lot of sensitive data, like including like customer data. Could be, for example, one industrial manufacturer has a lot of PCI data and related to, customer credit cards and stuff like that. Now, if you as an enterprise are going to lose any of this information, there are a whole bunch of consequences. In fact, if you've been tracking the news recently, the cost just to clean that up and get a handle on what happened can run like between $100 to $150 per record. And so if you end up losing like 10, 20 million records, that's just a gargantuan amount that you have to pay, and you are legally obligated to be able to do that. And the regulations mandate that you have to, for example, notify the people whose information you have lost and exactly what you have lost and what steps you're taking to be able to mitigate that. And so there's an inordinate amount of cost on the other end. And God forbid, like, if one of your plants gets shut down because of ransomware, then now you are looking at just actual tangible revenue. So from an industrial sector standpoint, the cost of a lot of this information, especially like sensitive personal data, comes with an actual number attached to it. And so it's very easy for them to understand or recognize the value of having to protect that information.
And I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times in the industrial sector, again, we think about downtime. That's the main factor and the main cost center, if you will, too, for a lot of these hacks. Well, it's not just that. With all the new regulatory standards that are in place, that also brings cost elements with it as well. So it's important to keep that in mind too.
That's exactly right. In fact, one recent industrial manufacturer, I can't name them, for their breach, their expenditure week one was $50 million. And they were expecting to spend close to $300 million by the time it was all said and done. So these costs can quickly add up. And all because on the front end of it, what is the old adage? Prevention is better than cure. It's the same concept here.
And just to be clear, we're just talking about response costs, remediation costs. We're not even talking about if they were extorted for ransom or anything like that, correct?
Absolutely. I'm literally just talking about things like you call in an incident investigation firm and you're going to have forensics work done on exactly what the scope of exposure was. You're going to then essentially be able to let them know exactly what happened and then the cost of cleanup. And I'm not even talking about the cost of ransomware. This is just a regular attack in a post breach sort of data theft situation.
That's insane. And, that's such a great point too, not that we're happy to share it, but just to give that reality to the situation when we're trying to convince those who control the purse strings a little bit to loosen them up for some of these cybersecurity tools that we need in keeping all of this data secure. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit there. You mentioned employees being such a big part of cybersecurity planning and the response and securing all of that information. Are there some tactics that you've seen that have helped either from a training perspective or just from a day-to-day sort of SOP that can help secure this data better than we have in the past?
Yeah, I think you can certainly train your end users into better behavior and forcing them into better awareness around what's going to happen. But as we're all aware, training only takes you so far, and you're often just one bad click away from getting from having an attacker enter your environment. And so you almost have to implicitly assume that people are going to enter your environment. People are going to find a way into your environment. Then the question is, what quickly, why are they into your network? They're not after your laptops, they're not after your networks, they're after your data. And the question then quickly becomes, can you reduce the blast radius and can you reduce the risk surface around your data? And the simplest way I like to explain this is, let's say you're a 500-person company and only 50 people need access to a certain type of information. If you have all 500 people having access to that data, it takes just any one of those 500 people to get compromised for all of your data to end up getting exposed. Whereas if you had the right sets of security principles and the governance principles and the implementation hygiene to essentially be able to reduce and implement some sort of a least privilege model on the back end where data is only accessed by people who should have access to that information, you can significantly reduce the blast radius. Where, for example, if only those 50 people had access to sensitive information, now you have to penetrate or compromise one of those users. And so data governance and least privilege data access principles becomes an essential prerequisite for any sort of a meaningful cybersecurity program within the industrial sector.
I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that we're trying to do now with all these visualization strategies and everything throughout manufacturing, where everybody can see the data, see how we're tracking, how many units we're getting out the door versus our goal, being secure with that data also puts some restriction potentially around it. What advice could you give manufacturers in sort of juggling that dynamic between, yes, we want everybody to be involved and share in how we're performing, but at some point, we can't let everybody up on the cloud. We can't let everybody in the boat to see everything that's going on for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think, look, it all starts with the fact that data is information and different data sets have different levels of risk associated with them. For example, we have a industrial company for whom they have export control data, and there's no ifs and buts about how they have to treat that data. It's extremely sensitive, both for, if that information were to get out, it could seriously jeopardize their operations, not to mention they would be in serious violation of the law. And so there's always going to be like crown jewels and important information that you have to make sure that you're able to put effective controls around. And then you may have data on a sliding scale where there's data that's potentially important, but not quite so sensitive and so on. The first thing in any of these approaches is to get a good handle on all of your data. The challenge, especially around data, has traditionally been even things like discovering data has been a hugely manual, laborious, intensive process. There are newer technologies and solutions out there today that can actually help you understand your data with context. And so once you've done that, you can identify the data that you really, really care about, and then make sure that you're able to put the effective sets of guardrails around that. And when it comes to that sort of data, you won't usually find any objection even from the business units, because that's essential to their operation as well.
That discovery element that you just talked about there, that's a big challenge for the industrial sector, just understanding all the different assets we have out there. Now, we're not going to get into like endpoints and connections and stuff like that here today, but that data is, like you just talked about, it has to be visible. You understand where it is and how vulnerable it might be. What have you seen in terms of best practices or strategies that can help people realize, man, I have data in all these different places that I need to protect and keep secure? Just getting that better visibility of the threat landscape from a data perspective.
Traditionally, data discovery has been a very manual process. It's often required security teams to write patterns and rules looking for specific sets of information. In the kind of complicated fairly complex landscape that we live in today, that's almost an impossible task for most enterprises. And so the that whole thinking has to shift from manual error-prone processes to a more automated approach where you're able to understand your data with context. For example, is this contract information? Is this financial data? Is this intellectual property? And so the context around the data becomes super important. And there, I think there's a lot of newer technologies that have emerged that allows for customers to potentially get that sort of visibility into your data without you having to do a lot of work up front. Traditionally, our experiences across industries, including things like manufacturing, they're spending $5 to $10 on people for every dollar in data security solution cost just to operationalize the discovery process. And so understanding the data with extreme high fidelity and with extreme great degree of accuracy becomes super important. Once that happens, then you can help get a sense of who has access to this information. Is it appropriate, inappropriate? And you can get a meaningful view of the risk within your environment and then take appropriate action.
I'm glad you kind of spread the way you spelled that out, because it not only justifies the expense, but also the time. That's so important in the manufacturing sector in terms of how we allocate and justify the time spent, but it makes a ton of sense the way you just laid it out there. Now, I'm probably teeing you up to talk about your company a little bit here, but when it comes to that data discovery element, I'm assuming artificial intelligence is one of the tools that's now available to help speed up that process and make it a little bit less manual, maybe a little bit less painful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you an example just to make this real, right? If I were to hand you, Jeff, a document and I would say, hey, can you make sense of it? What is the first thing you would do? You're not going to go look for the word and the and so on, right? You're going to glance at the document and try to make sense of it. So you're able to derive some level of context and meaning around, okay, what am I looking at? And once you do that, you then go in and read it, and then you're able to distill the finer points out of it, right? Now, traditionally, the way machines have done it is the complete opposite. Machines will go in and look for specific things. They'll look for a 9-digit number because it looks like a social security number, or they look for a 16-digit number because of credit card information. And often, because you lack the context, you're going to get a lot of false positives and false negatives from that. Now, generative AI and language models have allowed for customers to take that sort of mimic that human approach to understanding data, where if you were to look at data, machines can now tell you, hey, am I looking at a legal document? Am I looking at a financial document? Am I looking at intellectual property? And the difference between machines and humans is, if I were to ask you to do it for petabytes of scale, as humans, we couldn't do it. Whereas machines don't get tired and they can actually do this at scale. And so generative AI, in particular in data security, has a very relevant role in helping enterprises understand your data with context, so that you can then get a good sense of where all of your sensitive information is without doing any work up front.
Excellent. Well, that kind of leads into probably some of the things that you guys are doing. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the company and some of the things you're doing to help support industrial cybersecurity.
Sure. Concentric.ai is a AI-driven data security governance company. We use AI to help enterprises discover, monitor, and protect a lot of their sensitive data. Very specifically, we use language models to help customers understand their data with context. So if you pointed us at your various data stores, we can come back and tell you, here's all of your intellectual property, here's your financial data, here's your PII, PCI, PHI data. And not only can we discover it with an extremely high degree of accuracy without customers having to do any work up front, we can then also help customers understand where there's risk to this data, from inappropriate access, entitlements, permissions, sharing, activity, to get a risk-oriented view into that, and then help remediate and protect that, where we can fix permissions or move data to the right location, data management and stuff. And we can do this across structured, unstructured data on premises and the cloud, extending into even things like email messaging applications. And customers today have deployed this from terabytes to petabytes at scale, without having a large security team, to significantly bring the risk down. For many manufacturing companies, we have brought down the risk by close to 80% of data at risk, to where at a fraction of cost, like at less than a cent per record compared to some of the cleanup costs I talked about post breach. So the ROI for deploying a solution like us is fairly huge.
Interesting. You've mentioned risk a couple different times. It's a big part of what you deal with. Right now, when you look at the bad guys and some of the things that they're up to, are you seeing any patterns? Is it still the sort of traditional approaches? You mentioned a lot of the phishing techniques and email compromise that really can get after that personal data. Are you seeing any other groups out there that are kind of lighting up your radar, or are the tactics evolving or changing a whole lot from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the goal at the end of the day is to be able to get into a network, because uh, most enterprises are fairly defenseless once attackers are inside your network. Escalating privileges is extremely easy. Moving around is easy. Getting access to data starts to become easy. So the techniques that we see are really around more sophisticated ways to be able to mimic your users, and to be able to elicit response. And so you can actually compromise and get into an environment.
So just those emails again, the spear phishing, all those tactics, just sort of
Correct.
ratcheting up to the next level.
And starting to see some deep fakes as well, because
Wow.
our ability to mimic another human now has become extremely easy, to where I can literally listen to a couple of podcasts of you, Jeff, and we could put together a nice video of somebody pretty much mimicking your style of operation. And so that's in its infancy, but we're starting to see increasingly sophisticated ways in which that's being utilized to be able to mimic people, so as to eventually get access to their data or get access to their information.
So in a lot of these instances, does it still go back to some of the real simple approaches of, hey, verifying people when they call, following up, to make sure you're talking to that person as opposed to seeing a video or trusting an email? Is it that basic, or are we developing other tools that are maybe helping us out even more with those types of situations?
I think at the end of the day, this is like responding to a flu with more and more flu medication, without potentially recognizing underlying patterns, right? At the end of the day, if as an enterprise you recognize that people's ability to get into your network is just inevitable, then you really have to start not from the user. I mean, not that those approaches have to be completely eliminated, but there also has to be approaches placed on the other side from an access perspective. How do you manage governance around your data? How do you manage access to your data? Making sure that you've got the right set of governance principles and access principles to your data will ensure that you are minimizing the blast radius, you're minimizing the risk from any sort of a compromise within your environment. So you almost have to think data out, versus user in, which has traditionally been the mindset for most companies for at least a couple of decades now.
No, absolutely. That change in mindset is going to be key. That's a great point. Talking about risk again, big risk, obviously, in industrial settings is ransomware. We've kind of talked on the periphery of that already, but when you're looking at responding to a ransomware attack, somebody's got the data, they're holding it hostage. What are the types of tactics that you typically try to encourage or employ industrial companies to take in responding to those specific types of attacks?
Today, for the most part, believe it or not, when a ransomware attack hits, most companies don't even actually know what data was impacted. Let's say for a second that I were to be able to help you understand what data was impacted. That data may have been of no value to you at all. As an example, even understanding the scope of what was impacted is not something that most enterprises have today. And so what that leads to is a very binary discussion about, should I pay the ransomware, should I not? Instead of a discussion about, hey, what is the data that was impacted? Is it material to the company? What portion of it was important? What is the impact of that? So the first thing that I always tell customers is, if you don't have a good sense of where all of your sensitive data is within your environment, you're pretty much flying blind to any one of these attacks, because they're going to hold you hostage because it's very asymmetric warfare at that point. And so the thing I always encourage people is make sure that you've got a good plan to understand where all of your sensitive data is. Do you have a good backup plan to make sure that this data is backed up? And when you have a backup recovery plan, understanding all of your sensitive data also becomes important there, because you can also then decide which data to recover first. And so some sort of a prioritized sequencing of the recovery process starts to become important, because it's not like you can just blanket like recover everything like, within like 24 hours. So how do you bring the more essential systems online first? And so having that plan together, where from a primary system to a backup system, you've got a full plan to understand your data, back it up, get a good sense of what is important, not important. So you can then prioritize that. And not to mention, when you have a ransomware attack, do you even know which types of data were impacted? How can you easily do an investigation? So data governance becomes an essential first step to any sort of a meaningful ransomware plan, because that's where it starts. And then eventually, when you're recovering that data, it becomes extremely important in that it makes your job of being able to respond and recover from it that much easier.
Well, it's interesting you bring up about not even knowing all the data that was potentially captured or is being hijacked. Leads into visibility. It also leads into this ongoing issue of these live off the land attacks, where people are getting in the networks and they're not getting kicked out. And therefore these folks get ransomed again in 6 months. It just feels like this visibility dynamic could help solve so many different problems, but it's establishing those priorities. Is there different advice that you give to folks in terms of once they start digging into where all this data is and trying to associate priorities with it, that they just don't get sort of overwhelmed by everything that there is to do? Is there a way to sort of help them manage this influx of data or influx of responsibility that they may not have thought about before?
We'll be back after a quick break.
AI is changing the game of business. Will you be on the winning team? I'm Jordan Wilson, the host of the Everyday AI podcast, and your coach to help you learn the X's and O's of AI. Artificial intelligence isn't just a new player in the game, it's a new sport altogether. So if you don't quickly put AI into play, your competitors will run up the score. I've spent my whole life building winning teams, from coaching basketball to working with big players like Nike and Jordan Brand. My next move? Helping you win with Everyday AI. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or on everydayaipodcast.com. Let's tap into AI together and put points on the board.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges, right? Which is these approaches have been so manual in the past that most customers it shouldn't have to be this hard. That's the broader point, right? I think there are ways in which this entire process can be automated, where the discovery process can be automated, understanding risk. A simplest example I like to give, back to your point you were trying to make. The reason that ongoing activity, for example, you miss and you get ransomware again is because when you get any sort of an activity alert, for every meaningful alert that it actually produces, it's going to give you 20 false positives. And so after a while, your SOC team just throws up their hands and says, I can't deal with any of this stuff. And so now the reason that that's, for example, something that absolutely can be improved, where the activity analytics that you have around things that you see needs to be tied back to sensitive information that it's able to, for example, access. And so how do you make sure that on an ongoing basis, alerts that your security teams are investigating are meaningful and tied to specific access to sensitive data that you care about? And so it all starts with, once you have an effective idea of where all of your sensitive data is, you can narrow it down to what's important. And on an ongoing basis, you can automate that process to where the data access can be tied back with anything that you're seeing on the network for meaningful, actionable, manageable set of alerts that you can actually triage and do something about.
Shifting gears a little bit, Karthik, that was a great explanation. But shifting gears, let's talk a little bit about some of the other elements that are really pushing cybersecurity into the mainstream a little bit. One of those, I think, from a regulatory perspective, has been what the SEC has done. I think there's been maybe no more impactful regulatory body, just because having to report stuff to the SEC puts all of this out there for everybody else to see and understand who got hit, how they responded to it. when you look at what the SEC is forcing a lot of larger manufacturers or publicly traded companies to do you see that as a place where other government regulation can come in to help with cybersecurity? Do we want to keep government out of this? What's your take in terms of their role from a bigger picture, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the privacy regulations that, for the most part, that have become, that have come in over the last, I would say, half a decade are here to stay. And so they're not going away. With regards to regulations, look, people have different opinions on whether they're important, not important. But the reality of it is, if you're a regulated entity, these regulations aren't going away, no matter, what's going to happen. And so you have to live within that environment. And when you have customer data, for example, you have an obligation to protect the customer data, right? So it's not like you can walk away from that obligation. And so you're right. Some of these SEC regulations have been extremely meaningful, and they've gone well beyond just advising you on what to do in front of a breach to also actually advising you on what to do on the front end. For example, data classification now is almost an imperative step in that whole data security journey for most enterprises as an active cybersecurity regulation guideline. And so, and I think a lot of what's being recommended is fairly common sense. Especially from a data standpoint, where too often data has remained behind, right? People have focused so much on malware detection, malware prevention, network level visibility on what's going on, that the data layer has remained, has been given short shrift. And so I think some of these efforts and regulations are just steps in the right direction to be able to address that. And I think, and frankly, for example, our risk reduction projects for most enterprises comes down to like 1 cent a record, if not less. And so there are very cost-effective ways to substantially reduce risk around your data that that don't have to cost a lot, and that can still make sure that you're in compliance with a lot of the regulations that are coming out.
Yeah. Staying in that theme, and I'm not trying to be political here or anything like that, but one of the biggest assets, I think, for manufacturers too, has been CISA. I think the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency has been tremendous in terms of the information that they have put out. And a lot of that started with Jen Easterly, who's going to be stepping down with the new administration coming in. Looking at that, if you're going to talk to the Trump administration in terms of establishing priorities for CISA, is there anything that kind of comes to mind? Is it staying the course, or are there some things that maybe they could do differently over the next couple of years?
Well, regardless of whose administration is in power, at the end of the day, even if you ignore like common criminals from nation states and standpoint, information is power, and so that is not going ever. Yeah. That is never ever going away. And you can already see it's a fairly volatile political landscape that we're in. Not just, I'm talking internationally, right, between what's happening in the Middle East and Russia and Ukraine and so on. And so at the end of the day, industrial, and if we plan to have a robust industrial policy and a robust industrial manufacturing base, making sure that we protect our information and that our systems are not under attack is going to be a priority, regardless of who's in power. And so I think continuing a lot of those policies to make sure that our industrial systems are safe and secure from attack. And more importantly, a lot of our intellectual property and our key information is kept away from nation state actors is extremely important. And that's not even looking at ransomware criminals and stuff. That's looking at nation state level attacks where the level of sophistication is orders of magnitude greater than what some of your ransomware folks can actually do. And so the threat is real, and it's up to us to pay heed to it.
Absolutely. Karthik, any other trends that you see having an impact over the next couple of years, 12, 18 months maybe?
I think generative AI is going to be pervasive, both in its applicability to help security solutions, but also just generative AI as usage across environments is going to have a transformative impact on security. If you talk about, let's take manufacturing sector, you can now have an employee querying some of your Gen AI models about how the company is doing, and it's going to essentially pull information across the entire environment and presenting information that potentially that employee shouldn't have access to. Maybe like, for example, your private income statements before they've actually come out. And so as generative AI starts to become more pervasive, the need for effective data governance becomes that much more important. Because you have to make sure that you're keeping information out of the guardrail, out of, putting guardrails around the data, putting some adequate fencing around it, making sure that your employees are not just going to ChatGPT and putting some of your proprietary information out there. And so protecting your information from Gen AI becomes important, but then also Gen AI and its ability to learn in an unsupervised capacity, and what the models are capable of doing is a transformative step in AI compared to anything we've seen before. And so I think its applicability to also help, for example, with preventing malware attacks, helping protect data. You're going to see some exciting solutions that technologies come out, I would say, over the next 2 to 3 years.
Absolutely. AI is that double-edged sword if there ever was one. It will be interesting to see which end of it comes out more prominent. So we'll definitely keep an eye on it.
Right. It's exactly like the advent of the internet, and there's going to be good and bad. And we're going to eventually accept it and find ways around it.
Thanks, Karthik. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check him out at Concentric.ai. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Karthik Krishnan, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.